Transphobia, in its many forms, continues to evolve based on social, cultural, and technological contexts. While it is crucial to identify physical aggressions, microaggressions, and exclusion dynamics within the LGBTQ community and the trans collective itself, it is equally important to explore other areas and phenomena where transphobia manifests in new or less obvious ways. One of these spaces is the digital environment, especially social media and online communication platforms. Although the internet has been vital in connecting trans people, creating support communities, and raising awareness of their rights, it has also become a space where transphobia thrives alarmingly. Social platforms enable the spread of hate speech, misinformation about trans people, and the organization of mass harassment campaigns. The algorithms of these networks, designed to maximize engagement, often amplify sensationalist and transphobic content, giving it more visibility than positive or educational messages. Online harassment against trans people goes beyond mere insults or derogatory comments. It includes non-consensual sharing of personal information, doxing, identity theft to discredit individuals, manipulation of images and videos, deepfakes, and coordinated attacks aimed at silencing or intimidating trans activists and content creators. These dynamics have real-world consequences, affecting the mental health, safety, and well-being of those targeted. In the media, the representation of trans people remains problematic. Although there has been progress in including trans characters in film, television, and literature, many portrayals still fall into harmful stereotypes. Trans women, for instance, are often depicted as villains, tragic victims, or comic relief, while trans men and non-binary individuals remain largely absent from mainstream media. This lack of representation, or its distortion, helps maintain prejudice and misinformation among the general public. News coverage also reveals transphobia in how cases of violence or discrimination against trans people are reported. Headlines often misgender victims, reveal their birth names, or focus on irrelevant aspects of their gender identity. This lack of journalistic ethics not only perpetuates stigma but also reinforces the narrative that trans people are marginal figures rather than citizens with full rights. The sports world is another recurring stage for transphobic debates. Discussions around the participation of trans women in women's sports have been used by conservative sectors to question the validity of their identities and restrict their access to athletic spaces. These debates are often fueled by scientific misinformation and essentialist arguments about the body and physical performance. Policies that seek to exclude trans people from certain competitions not only deny their right to participate in sports, but also reinforce the idea that trans bodies are inherently unfair or abnormal. In mental health care, institutionalized transphobia remains a significant barrier. Despite major medical organizations no longer classifying trans identity as a mental disorder, many trans people still encounter prejudice from healthcare professionals. In some cases, they must prove their identity or conform to certain gender stereotypes to access hormone therapy or gender-affirming surgeries. This covert pathologization perpetuates the notion that being trans is something that needs to be corrected or externally validated. A related issue is the so-called passing trap, referring to the pressure many trans people feel to fit cis-normative beauty standards to be recognized according to their gender identity. This pressure creates constant stress and can lead to rushed medical decisions or the invisibilization of those who do not achieve, or do not wish to achieve, this aesthetic ideal. Trans people who do not pass, meaning they are not socially perceived as cisgender, often face higher levels of discrimination and violence. In legal and political contexts, transphobia has also adapted to new strategies. While many countries have advanced laws recognizing trans rights, others have enacted legislation that restricts these rights under pseudoscientific or moralistic arguments. Some of these laws prohibit access to hormone blockers for trans minors, limit participation in school sports, or criminalize gender expression in public spaces. These measures not only violate fundamental rights, but also foster a climate of hatred and misinformation. In education, transphobia infiltrates curricula and teacher training. In many educational systems, the existence of trans people remains ignored or treated as a taboo subject. The lack of inclusive educational materials generates misinformation among students and reinforces prejudice. Furthermore, many teachers lack adequate training on gender diversity, leaving them unequipped to address bullying against trans students or create inclusive environments. Religion is another sphere where transphobia manifests in various forms. While there are inclusive religious communities, many traditional doctrines continue to promote narratives that deny the validity of trans identities, labeling them as sinful or deviant. These narratives not only impact the self-esteem and mental health of trans believers, but are also used to justify discriminatory policies in areas such as education, adoption, and marriage. In family environments, transphobia can have devastating consequences. Family rejection is one of the leading causes of homelessness among trans individuals, especially youth. Many families, influenced by social prejudice or religious beliefs, expel or isolate their trans children, leaving them vulnerable to poverty, exploitation, or violence. Even in families that avoid open rejection, microaggressions are common, such as refusing to use correct names and pronouns, imposing traditional gender roles, or treating trans identity as a sensitive topic that must be hidden. Another dimension of transphobia is its economic impact. Trans people face higher rates of unemployment, workplace discrimination, and economic precariousness. Barriers to formal employment force many trans individuals, particularly trans women of color, into sex work as a means of survival. This situation exposes them to greater risks of violence, exploitation, and criminalization. The lack of support networks and job opportunities also limits their access to safe housing, higher education, and specialized medical care. Psychologically, the cumulative effects of transphobia generate high levels of stress, anxiety, and depression among trans people. Suicide rates among trans individuals are significantly higher than in the general population, especially in contexts where social and family support is lacking. Constant discrimination, fear of violence, and systemic invisibilization create emotional strain that directly impacts mental health and overall well-being. To confront these manifestations of transphobia, adopting an intersectional approach in the fight for trans rights is essential. Intersectionality recognizes that discrimination is not experienced in isolation but intersects with other forms of oppression, such as racism, classism, ableism, and xenophobia. For example, a Black trans woman will face exclusion dynamics distinct from those of a white trans woman due to the compounded effects of racism and transphobia. Combating transphobia requires action on multiple fronts, from creating inclusive public policies to incorporating gender diversity education at early school stages. Legal and healthcare systems must be reformed to remove structural barriers faced by trans people, while cultural narratives that perpetuate stigma and prejudice must also be challenged. Ultimately, the goal should not merely be to tolerate the existence of trans people, but to fully recognize them as rights-bearing individuals with autonomy over their bodies, identities, and lives. Only then can we build a truly just and inclusive society where all people, regardless of their gender identity, can live with dignity, safety, and freedom. Transphobia, in its many forms, continues to evolve based